Have you ever dated an avoidant attachment style and found yourself wondering, why am I not a priority? Perhaps you even found that things started off on the right foot. Things were going extremely well during the dating and perhaps honeymoon stages of love. But as you moved into the power struggle stage or progressive phases of a relationship, things seemed to drop off, and maybe you became less and less of a priority as time went on. Well, if this is something that happened to you, you may relate to today's question we actually have coming in from somebody who says, why does my avoidant partner prioritize video games over me? And for some people, it's video games. For other people, it's hobbies, it's friendships, it's being on social media over prioritizing the relationship. And today we're going to break down exactly why this happens and, most importantly, what you can do about this to create a healthy and much more beneficial outcome. Now, this is actually from a clip of our most recent podcast. And if you want to check out the podcast in its full version, I will put a link to that below. Or if you want to check out any of the different podcasts on our channel or on Apple, Spotify, I will leave those links down below as well. And lastly, if this is something that you're having a hard time with in your relationship and you actually want to really build momentum as quickly as possible, first watch this video, but I'll also link a free course down below that will help you actually improve the intimacy in your relationship. It's called Attachment Styles and Sex, and it's fully free for a limited time. So, our next question here is from Julie, who's 45 years old in California. And Julie says, can you please tell me a little bit about the love of video games and dismissive avoidant attachment style? I am in a 15-year relationship with a dismissive avoidant who always says he doesn't have time for us. Yet he plays endless hours of video games and doesn't seem to ever make an effort for the actual relationship. I feel like he's literally addicted to video games at this point and will stay up until all hours of the morning playing with friends, and yet still not making time to do things like go out on a simple date. Please help. So, what do we know about the avoidant attachment style and creature comforts? Well, we know that for dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance alike, they both tend to get this label where they're like pretty good self soothers. Now, I have a big bone to pick with that. I don't think that could really be further from the truth. I tend to feel that dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance alike are not necessarily great at self soothing, but more like self numbing. One of the big differences I would say between self soothing and self numbing is that self soothing is us actually getting to the bottom of things and resolving root cause of why we felt emotionally frustrated or sad or disrupted in some way to begin with. So let's just go through an example here for a moment and then we'll dive into this question. You know, if somebody is a fearful avoidant attachment style or a dismissive avoidant, let's stay on dismissive avoidant for this conversation, and they feel stressed about their boss not respecting their boundaries at work, they may come home and their form of quote unquote self soothing may be to sit down and play countless hours of video games. That's just numbing and distracting and really suppressing the problem, just avoiding the problem. Self soothing would look like I'm driving home from work. I realize that I'm feeling frustrated. I tune into myself and I'm like, why do I feel bad? Oh, I feel frustrated or upset because my boss isn't respecting my boundaries. Okay, how can I solve for this? What do I need to feel relief? Oh, I need to go to my boss and politely say that while I really value my job and care about this, I am happy to go out and go above and beyond as much as I can. But here's where my boundaries are. Okay. So, for example, you might say, listen, I really care about this company. I really want to show up and go above and beyond. And I have a family at home and I have a lot of responsibilities. So I'm happy to stick around for an extra 15 or 20 minutes late each day, Monday through Friday, for a period of time while we're going through this transition phase. But I'm not able to do that forever or on an ongoing basis. And that's where my boundaries are, right? And so, what we're doing when we self soothe is we're really attuning to self, figuring out why we're upset and what we're feeling, and then we're solving on behalf of it. And unfortunately, when we look at a lot of dismissive avoidance, they're not self soothing, right? They're not like emotionally attuning to themselves, conveying or communicating to self, oh, I'm feeling sad or frustrated or angry. And here's why, instead they're just not feeling good. and usually shoving things way down emotionally, kind of trying to stuff them down with distractions. And so, this can range their creature comforts or ways of distracting or numbing can range from things like binge eating food and sugar or drinking too much or smoking weed or, you name it. But it can also include things like gambling, video games, all these sorts of dynamics. Now, I'm not going to sit here because I don't believe this. I'm not going to sit here and say anybody who plays video games is numbing or anybody who ever drinks alcohol is numbing. I think that the relationship we have to these things is what matters, right? If somebody plays a video game once a week or, drinks alcohol on the weekend with a friend socially, like these are not things that are necessarily numbing. We can do this because we enjoy this. It's social, it's fun, it's a hobby. We get enjoyment and fulfillment out of it, and we're not using it as a coping mechanism. But you'll know the difference. And maybe this is even a question that you listening right now can reflect on. Everybody tends to have their creature comforts. Are you using these creature comforts as a form of self numbing in an attempt to self soothe? Or do you have an overall fairly healthy relationship to these things? Now, I can tell by Julie's question here that clearly, playing video games till all hours of the morning and never making time for the relationship, it does seem like quite an addictive habit. And I do truly believe that people can become addicted to video games just like they can become addicted to gambling. And there can be a lot of intermittent reinforcement, novelty needs, all sorts of things. So, I want to talk about here just for a moment some of the wiring and kind of science behind this addictiveness to games to begin with. And then we'll talk about what Julie can do here. Okay. So, when we look at the science behind how we sort of get addicted to things, there's a lot of interesting components at play. Obviously, there's a brain chemistry component, but what I found more than anything is that we tend to get the most stuck on investing in things that meet our deeply unmet needs. And so what happens is we'll often when I've worked with a lot of people in the past who would come to me and say, "Hey, I have," I'll give one example here. I had a client at one point and they came to me and they said, "Look, I'm really struggling with addiction to pornography." And so we looked, okay? We didn't start by judging it and shaming it because that doesn't do anything for us. We have to look with an attitude of curiosity. We look at, well, what needs does pornography meet? This person was also a dismissive avoidant attachment style. And the big needs, when we had an honest discussion about it, were novelty, a sense of control, a sense of connection, a sense of safety, and pleasure. And so we have these 5 needs. And when we asked this individual, when I asked this client at the time, well, are these needs being met in your life outside of pornography? Let's score how much these things are being met in your life from 1 to 10. Well, guess what? All of those scores came back really low. He felt like he didn't really have another source of pleasure in his life. He felt like he didn't really have a sense of control. And he didn't feel like there was a lot of novelty and safety in his ability to connect with people. So those 5 things were kind of missing. And so all at once, pornography is a subconscious strategy to meet multiple of those needs at the same time. And when there's on top of that, the ability to do things like get connection, even though it's not the same type of connection as being in person with somebody, when there's this ability to get connection, in a way where, okay, I can get my needs met for connection, but I don't have to be vulnerable. I don't have to move towards any of my fears or wounds in the process. I can literally get connection without even having to address those fears or wounds. It's even easier for us to get stuck in more addictive patterns. And he had a lot of vulnerability fears as a dismissive avoidant. So he found himself getting his needs met while bypassing his core wounds or fears. Hence why it was sort of a recipe for this to become an addictive pattern. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say this is the only thing that applies to full scale, full blown addictions. But it's a very interesting thought exercise for discovering why we seem to foster dependency on some things more than others and what that says about our deeply unmet needs. And when we make an effort to get those deeply unmet needs met in healthier forms, it helps break dependencies. So that's a bigger topic of conversation, maybe for another episode. But let's talk about let's go back here to Julie's question from California. So Julie says, "Can you tell me about the love of video games and DA?" So, dismissive avoidant attachment style. So, this man who is your 15-year relationship plays tons and tons of video games all hours of the night. This to me, when we look at the relationship that he has to video games, it's too much, right? Like this is not, oh yeah, this is a fun activity. This is like a hobby that I have. This is obviously way beyond that. It seems to be a little bit of a dependency that's being fostered. And, that sort of goes par for the course for the creature comforts, that numbing dynamic or cycle that can often happen with an avoidant attachment style. So when we take this a step further, what can Julie do about it? Well, Julie cannot change his behavior. Julie can only really choose how to respond. Julie can encourage him to work on his own behavior. He could, seek counseling or therapy or something to sort of break that addiction, or just even start by trying to set some boundaries around video games, realizing that there's a little bit more of a dependency being fostered here. And he could go through that thought exercise, right? Of okay, well, what needs do video games meet? Now, I've had discussions with clients, with people in the personal development schools, courses, on our webinars, and in our programs, countless times about this topic. And again, you'll see the same types of needs being met in a similar way. So you'll see that video games tend to meet the need for social connection in a safe way that's not very vulnerable, right? You're not meeting in person. You don't have to go through all the awkward eye contact stuff if you feel awkward around people. You're connecting from behind a screen. You can literally just leave the video game or the interaction immediately if you'd like to. And interestingly, I've found that sometimes there's a bit of a correlation between people who are really into video games and people who struggled socially at different points in their life in various degrees and different forms. Not always, but strong correlation. Now, we can look at what other needs are being met. Okay. Social connection without being vulnerable. There's also this element of novelty again. Sometimes there's this element of learning or challenge. Okay. Almost like growth because you're growing through different levels in different ways. And again, all without having to be vulnerable. So, interestingly enough, when I've had discussions about individuals who have a little bit or a lot of dependency fostered around video games, they tend to have deeply unmet needs for, you guessed it, social connection, novelty, and growth, maybe personal growth in various forms. And so, if we decide we want to work through our dependencies around this, one of the big cornerstones of doing just that is to be able to sit down and find new ways of getting these needs met in forms that are a little healthier. So that these buckets, if you imagine your needs are like buckets in the subconscious mind, they're not running on empty, or then, oh my gosh, video games are the only way to get these needs met. And they may even be like a more superficial way of getting the needs met, meaning a less efficient way of getting those needs met or those buckets filled than if we went more direct to the source. We learn to get empowered and feel comfortable in social connections or trying new things or doing some deeper personal growth work rather than growing through levels of a video game. Now, that's really between him and his counselor or therapist or some of the inner work he may want to do at some point. What can Julie do here in this particular case? Well, Julie can encourage him to do that work. But I think Julie, rather than this being more focused on him and where he's at, it's really a question of what are your needs? What are you looking for in a relationship? And are you happy? And what I would highly recommend doing, Julie, is sitting down and making a list of what needs you're looking to have met in a relationship and those things that are really important to you and describing what that really looks like. So, do you need to feel prioritized in your relationship? Do you need to feel like there's a certain degree of quality time? And if so, how much? Do you need to feel like this person's willing to work on things in a relationship with you? What are your needs in a relationship? And I'll even put a link down below to a free download all about your needs and also a free download about how to reprogram the subconscious mind. And when we take a look here at our needs, it's really valuable to take a look at the different needs that you have in a relationship with somebody and ask yourself from 1 to 10, how much are these really important needs? If I wrote down my top 5 or 10 needs from a relationship, how much are these things being met? And if the scoring is very low, if we're not hitting close to like 80% of the way, which I think is a very fair goal to have, I would even say opt for something closer to 90. But, in the very least, we have the 80-20 rule. And if you're not seeing 80% of your needs being met, or somewhere really close to it, I would then turn around and set a deadline. And what I mean by a deadline is a deadline for the amount of time you will continue in a relationship if your needs aren't being met. Now, this deadline will look different for different people. Okay. If you're extremely unhappy, if you feel like 5% of your needs are being met, but you're in a marriage with 3 children and a mortgage, and there's this sort of, familial and financial dependency fostered on each other, that may look different, right? That deadline you set for how long you'll stay in a relationship that is unhealthy, where you're very unfulfilled, maybe a year or 2 years. And I'll tell you what to do with that deadline in just a moment. But if you're dating somebody for, in Julie's case, 15 years, and it doesn't sound like they're married, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of I'm not sure if you even live together. You may set this as something closer to 6 months. Now, when you set a deadline, that's just step one. Step two then becomes, Julie, making sure that you sit down and you go, okay, in this 6-month period of time, and you get to pick the deadline, by the way, okay, relative to how much investment you have in the relationship and what feels like you can really pour everything you can in for that deadline period of time. So let's say it's 6 months. Okay, so for the next 6 months, I am going to do everything I can. I'm going to communicate my needs more. I'm going to see my needs through. I am going to make sure that I'm approaching this conversation in regards to my needs with a lot of transparency and openness. I'm going to reprogram my core wounds so that I'm not taking things as personally, so that I'm hardly ever triggered. And now that empowers me to be an even better communicator. So I'm really going to focus on my needs, my core wounds, and my communication. And if within that next 6 months, I don't see that needle really move, and I'm still batting nowhere near to 80% of my needs being met, that may be a time where you walk away from the relationship. You have to ask yourself, am I okay being in a relationship for the next 15 years with somebody who's never going on a date with me? We're never spending time together. And you may see tremendous growth. You may see that by you communicating your needs and seeing them through, and being really healthy in the way that you communicate so you can really be heard, and working through core wounds, you may find that you have tremendous success and fulfillment and the relationship completely transforms. Or you may find that there's literally no shift or change. And at that point, you have to decide if it's time to walk away. So I think this is more of a question. It's a really interesting question about the creature comforts and the video games, but I actually think it's more of a question about your needs being met and how fulfilled you are and what you can do with that. And again, from the top, if we just write out all of our needs that are important in a relationship, see how much they're being met from 1 to 10, start working on where they're not being met by empowering better communication, really sharing about our needs more often, and reprogramming core wounds, we will either see huge growth in that relationship dynamic or maybe no growth at all. And then you position yourself for a win win because either you walk away guilt and regret free, knowing you did everything you can and that this is the right move out of loyalty and care for self, or you have an even better outcome where the relationship transforms and needs are being met and communication has improved and you feel way more fulfilled. And obviously, that's a huge win as well.